Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. This week, we're going to examine the issue of police misconduct, gun violence, the war on drugs, and the relationship amongst them all. In the second half of our show, we'll speak with Major Neil Franklin, 34-year police veteran and the executive director of an organization called LEAP, or Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. Up first, we're pleased to welcome Jonathan Blanks, Senior Research Associate at the Cato Institute's Project on Criminal Justice and Managing Editor of PoliceMisconduct.net. Jonathan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Bill.
Jonathan, I asked you on the program today to discuss two topics that you study and write about, police misconduct and gun control. I grew up in New York in the Serpico era, back when everyone just assumed that many big city cops were on the take. I remember the Knapp Commission and Mayor John Lindsay's promise to clean up the department. Here we are 45 years later. Has anything really changed?
Yeah, I think policing has changed over time. Even in New York, the Mullen Commission that happened about 20 years ago, it was 20 years after Serpico, described the differences in how police corruption manifested itself. Back in the Knapp Commission, it was mostly what they called grass eaters, where cops would take money and look the other way on, gambling, prostitution, that sort of thing. 20 years later, it became much more predatory. And instead of most cops or a lot of cops being on the take, it's these little bands stealing, robbing. So it's become much more pernicious. But I think overall policing has become much more professional. They're generally much more polite when dealing with the public. But it still has these pockets. So I think police misconduct has changed over time, but it's not necessarily all good.
Why has the Cato Institute launched an independent fact-finding project in this area, and what are its aims?
We took over the project a couple of years ago. David Packman was the original author of the Police Misconduct website, and he just sort of got overwhelmed with how much work had to go into it. And he actually put it up for an auction, and Cato said, we're very interested in this because we've been interested in criminal justice and civil liberties for a very long time. And while we deal a lot with the Supreme Court and other legal issues that are sort of really technical and really high-level, need to know the details of the law stuff, how the public interacts with the police department is actually very important. I think it's really great that we've taken this on to kind of explain to the public, yes, you should trust police, but there are all these other problems that are going on, and the way that they take care of their own isn't necessarily good.
Well, so much of it also has been sensationalized. What does the data say about unjustified police shootings? Are they actually on the rise, or are we just more aware of them thanks to the advent of modern media?
It's hard to say, really. This was the first year that I think we've had a much fuller picture of how often police are shooting individuals. The Washington Post and the Guardian UK both did excellent work collecting data from crowdsourcing all across the country. Washington Post concentrated on shootings, whereas Guardian did all deaths in custody. Before this, I think the average per year was about 300 to 400 people shot by American police every year that we thought. And it turns out this year it was nearly 1,000. I think the last total was 985 or something very close to that.
So that could be better reporting, or it could be there's a rise.
It could be. I think without being able to compare data over years, it would be not necessarily irresponsible, but it's too early to say that there is a rise right now. I think it really is better reporting, and the people are able to crowdsource this information, because before, just like misconduct stories, a cop gets busted for selling drugs or something like that. That's very local. If you're in, like, my hometown of Fort Wayne, Indiana, there's 250,000 people in the metropolitan area, but people in New York don't care. People in D.C. don't care. There's no national appetite necessarily for collecting that information. At least there hadn't been a governmental or any other kind of superstructure to do it. But as technology has advanced, we've been able to crowdsource information from a whole bunch of different organizations, whether it's local news organizations, blogs dedicated to finding this information, and it's just much easier with the search engines and the internet that we can do now.
Vast swaths of American industry are required by regulators to keep meticulous data on all sorts of aspects of their business that get rolled up and reported to various authorities. Why hasn't that occurred in policing?
I think part of it is the Constitution. The federal government doesn't have the authority to compel all this sort of information from local police departments. And so they've been very reticent to actually turn it over. Some police departments have actually been very good about transparency and explaining use of force incidents. Dallas Police Department is actually an exemplar here. But unfortunately, police departments aren't incentivized to turn over information about wrongdoing, again, whether it's use of force or whether it's internal police corruption.
What role does the so-called blue wall of silence play in thwarting scrutiny of police officer problems?
Blue wall of silence plays a massive role in keeping information from the public. There's a culture in policing that spans across almost every kind of department, whether it's a small county department or it's a large metropolitan area like New York. And there's a very strong incentive to be loyal to one another. And so everything is supposed to happen in-house. All discipline is supposed to happen in-house. And it's very difficult for police departments to get that information to the public because the rank and file isn't going to tell on each other. I've read stories where police officers want to turn in their comrades that are,
Crooked.
on the take, or I even saw something where he had child pornography, and the police officers were afraid to turn him in because of the retaliation that enforces the blue wall. And I think it's a really big problem that I don't think anyone really has a good answer for.
A small percentage of police officers seem to account for a disproportionately large percentage of misconduct accusations. What does that say?
I think what it shows is, again, the power of that blue wall of silence. Most police officers are good, law-abiding, respectful police officers, yet you have these little groups, like around 5 and 10%, depending on the department and what data you're collecting, that are responsible for the overwhelming number of resisting arrest complaints. Criminologists look at resisting arrest data to see which officers are charging people with resisting arrest, because resisting arrest can excuse or explain injuries that come in from suspects. And when it comes down to it, a suspect's word versus a police officer, the police officer is going to win 99% of the time. And so criminologists look at that information to see which officers are arresting people with that charge the most. And it turns out it's usually only about 5 or 10% of the population that is responsible for up to 50% of the resisting arrest complaints filed by police departments in as large as New York's, which has, 34,000 police officers, I think?
Interesting.
So because the police department is unable to discipline these officers and stop them from doing this, and the internal police structure isn't going to tell on them anyway, it's just very difficult to hold these police officers accountable until something is caught on video or some other way that this is brought into the open and it becomes a festering wound that the police department has to address.
Well, it's perhaps understandable why the justice system makes it hard to criminally prosecute police officers, but why can't they just be fired if there's a consistent pattern of complaints? I mean, if an Uber driver gets too many bad ratings, he's gone.
Yeah, unfortunately, particularly in metropolitan police departments, you have a very powerful police union, and they provide job protection for officers, which is, in theory, a very good thing. But what it turns into is job protection versus almost anything that isn't a criminal charge. I was at an event one day with D.C. Police Chief Kathy Lanier, and she talked about the need to find troubled officers before they get tenure. Basically, there's a probationary period in many of these departments that lasts from a year to 2 years. Sometimes I think it's 18 months in D.C. And if an officer messes up during that time, if they get, DUI or they get excessive force complaints, they are looked at very, very hard, and they don't have the normal protections that established officers have. And so then they can either address those problems that the police officer has, or they can dismiss him. After that, the union will fight to the teeth for almost any officer who's accused of a crime, and they have various mechanisms set up. You have arbitrators that say, oh, you tried to fire this guy, but we think he needs his job back. And he gets the job back, and there's nothing that the city can do. And so police leadership's hands are tied very often, because once you have police officers that are with seniority that are in the system, it's very difficult to get them out.
Sounds just like teachers' unions and bad teachers.
Yes, but they don't carry guns.
So, Jonathan, we've been talking about police misconduct, and it's becoming increasingly necessary to support innocent police officers who are involved in justified shootings, given the lynch mobs that often form once the media gets involved. Are these protections sufficient, and how are they exploited by the guilty?
I probably wouldn't use the term lynch mobs, but I understand that there are people who overreact to any time a police officer uses force. And I think the advent of body cameras has become very crucial in showing good cops versus bad cops. There was a case not too long ago where an individual was pulled over, and the police officer was like, license and registration. This is all caught on body cam. License and registration. And the guy, who's a 19-year-old kid, refused to give it to him. Now, it's very important to know your rights when you're dealing with the police, but when you're driving a car and they ask for your license, you have to give it to them. You're legally required to give it to them. And this kid refused, and he started taping. He started taping the encounter, and one thing led to another, and the police officer said, you can tape it, it's fine, but I need you to step out of the car. And over the course of these few minutes, the gentleman finally steps out of the car, and he gets down on the ground per police instructions, and he keeps trying to tape. Now, this is the point where the police officer has the right to arrest him because he defied a lawful order. And so to do that, he's going to put handcuffs on him, and he kicks the phone away. Now, keep in mind, his body camera's rolling this entire time, and the kid acts badly. He jumps up, which of course you never, ever do on the police officer. And he tried to overpower the police officer, and there was a fight, and the police officer shot the individual, killing him.
Oof.
Now, I saw a lot of people really upset about that case, but the fact of the matter is that the kid was in the wrong. And if you looked at the face of the police officer afterwards, it was a bloody mess. There's nothing from the tape that I've seen, at least, to say that police officer was wrong. For that reason, I think body cameras are good both to protect the public from bad officers, but also to protect officers from a public that is quick to overreact.
What is this law enforcement officer's Bill of Rights that people talk about?
The Law Enforcement Officer's Bill of Rights is a labor protection scheme of laws that was first brought up in the state of Maryland. And what this does is provides constitutional and extra-constitutional protections for police officers who are accused of any crime. So when a police officer is questioned, whether it's a use of force event or if it's in connection with a criminal investigation, they are both going to be asked as police employees, as public employees, but also as individuals with rights. And so for that reason, it is important that the police officer doesn't give up his Fifth Amendment right from self-incrimination, but also be held accountable administratively for any actions that happen, that like a mistake or negligence or something that happened. Unfortunately, the way the Bills of Rights have been drawn up is it gives police officers protections that no other defendant could possibly think they're ever going to get. For example, after an officer-involved shooting, there's always a cooling off period. In some jurisdictions, it's 24 hours or 48 hours. In other jurisdictions, it's 2 weeks. Now, I don't know how many other people who are accused of shooting someone to death will have a homicide detective come up to him and say, hey, I know you're in a rough spot. How about you take a couple days to cool off? Here's the name of a good defense lawyer. We'll come and talk to you then. And so it's not that I have a problem with this being necessarily a protection, but it cannot be just protection for the police. They need to be interviewed after it happens. If you need to get them a lawyer, that's perfectly fine, but they need to give witness just like everyone else. And it's protections like that that at least give the appearance of collusion, because so often when these cases come up, what happens in a shooting almost always sounds the same. And that's because
it's rehearsed.
Supreme Court precedent that says you can't shoot someone who's fleeing from you unless they are a dangerous felon or the public's in danger. And so whenever you hear about a shooting, it's like, he reached for his waistband. I feared for my life. He had something in his hand. All these things that promote something threatening is just going to come up in that report almost verbatim.
We've been through some pretty horrendous officer-involved killing fracases lately, including, Tamir Rice, Walter Scott, Freddie Gray. Are we learning anything from these experiences, or are we doomed to repeat the same cycle over and over?
That's a good question. I think we are learning insofar as that the public is much more aware of these things that are going on and becoming more aware of police practices like the Blue Wall of Silence and the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights. And again, it sort of just begs for these body cameras to be essentially universal, just so that we have evidence of what happened instead of it's the police officer's word against someone else's word or a dead body, that there is actually neutral evidence that the public has access to that can show exactly what happened. Because a lot of times where we're seeing in places where there was body cam or dash cam footage, like the 2014 shooting of Laquan McDonald in Chicago, there was evidence and it was withheld for a long time. And the police officers just happened to go into the area nearby that had surveillance equipment, and that evidence just happened to disappear. It can't accuse them of a crime, but it looks really bad. And so it's also important to have protections for the access to those sorts of footages. Otherwise, it's just, the tape went blank, we don't have anything. So that's one of those problems that we need to address as cameras become more ubiquitous.
Given the hundreds of millions of guns in the hands of private citizens in the U.S., are cops on hair trigger these days more than they've ever been before?
There is certainly some anecdotal evidence that police are reacting more quickly than they have in the past. I was on a panel once with a man who's a former U.S. Marshal named Matthew Fogg, and he was talking about how he got in tussles when he was a marshal, and people would ask him, "Why didn't you use your gun?" He's like, "Because I didn't fear for my life. I thought I could take him, and I did." And there's this pervasive mentality among police officers is that the first rule is to get home alive. In theory, that sounds like a good plan. Like, hey, of course, you and your colleagues need to be safe. But there is no officer safety exception to the Constitution, and they need to be more careful when dealing with the public because not everyone has a gun in their waistband. And it's perfectly normal to have your hands near your waistband, yet that is a reason why people are shot very often. Unarmed people are shot. And I think there is evidence that police are a little quick to use the gun these days.
Switching subjects in the time we have remaining, I'd like to talk to you about gun violence and gun control. You're a gun owner.
Yes, I am.
And you've written about your family's relationship with firearms. Walk us through that, starting with your grandfather.
Yeah, so my grandfather was born in 1883 as a sharecropper's son in Meridian, Mississippi. And so there was always this understanding of the dangers of racism, and that it would sometimes be up to the man of the house to take care of the family in case something went terribly wrong. And the family eventually moved up to Indiana, where I'm from, which in the early part of the 20th century was actually home to the Klan.
Right.
And the Klan would march up and down the street that my family lived on. And I was told of my grandfather grabbing his gun and calling all the kids in the house for safety. Now, as far as I know, he never actually had to fire the gun in self-defense, but that gun is mine, and it is probably my most prized possession. I will never sell it. It's going to stay in my family as long as it can be.
And your father was a police officer.
Yes, he was. People think that because I work in Misconduct that I'm anti-cop. That couldn't be further from the truth. I just want police officers to be responsible and to respect the individuals whom they serve. But yeah, guns were always in my house, and Dad's service revolver is the second gun that I own. And Dad had other guns around the house when I was growing up. They're always locked away. As a child, I didn't have access to any of them. It's just part of being a responsible gun owner.
And you've had occasions, as you've written, to want to have that gun nearby.
Yes. Years ago, when I was a bartender, I had a live-in girlfriend, and she worked with this woman. And the first time I had gone over to the woman's house, she was married. I met her husband, and on a lark, he decided to fireman carry me up a flight of stairs. I'm over 200 pounds. I'm 6 feet tall. That's not something that usually happens to me. This guy was showing his strength first time I met him. But it turns out, as I got to know this couple, he was an abusive husband. One night, she called up my girlfriend and said, "Can you give me a place to stay?" I was like, "Of course we can put her up. That's not a problem." But her husband was a very violent man, and he's a very strong man, and there is no way I could take him in a fight, and I know it. I don't own a baseball bat, and I didn't want to have to deal with him if he came over looking for her with anything that could be turned against me. Where a gun, which I owned, my father's service revolver, that I could protect both her and my girlfriend and myself if he showed up. Thankfully, he never did, but it was a really good insurance policy for me to protect a domestic violence victim in my own home. So often these debates get derailed by, "Oh, you're just a gun nut. You know, you love to fire guns." I do actually enjoy firing guns, but I also had a practical reason to own one. And it's just a security blanket when you don't live in the best neighborhood or you deal with people who are dangerous.
Many people are calling for common sense gun reform. What is that and what is it not?
The way common sense gun reform is usually used is by politicians who think that just to tweak changes and restrict access to firearms in ways that don't completely ban them, that we can save lives. But more often than not, they're just cosmetic changes. I mean, literally, the assault weapons ban of 1994 banned guns based on how they looked, whether they looked like military weapons. They weren't.
Right.
But they scared people, and so they banned it, and it had no effect on crime whatsoever. Government reports, no effect on crime. The background checks that have been popular recently, I'm for strengthening background checks. I think it's just a good policy to have, but that's not going to stop a lot of gun deaths because 2/3 of gun deaths are suicides. People who don't have criminal records are still going to pass a background check if they want to kill themselves. But instead of concentrating on the guns, we should have a comprehensive suicide prevention strategy. 2/3 of gun deaths are suicides, which account for half of all American suicides. All American suicides actually eclipse our gun deaths. And so I think we need to have a comprehensive anti-suicide strategy as opposed to making tweaks to the law here and there that isn't actually going to stop the vast majority of gun deaths.
Jonathan, it's been very instructive having you on the show. Thanks for being on.
Thanks, Bill. My pleasure.
That was Jonathan Blanks from the Cato Institute here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. You can check out Real Clear Radio on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Real Clear Frezza. And stop by RealClearMarkets.com, my go-to place for diverse views on political economics. Ahead, we'll speak with Major Neil Franklin, 34-year police veteran and the executive director of Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, about the consequences of the 40-year-old failed war on drugs. Stay tuned.